The sky above the planet Hellmire broke apart as the orbital blockade failed, and 3 massive super-destroyers fell from the atmosphere like burning stones. The clouds were thick with orange smoke, and the air tasted like ash and copper, while the ground shook from the impact of the crashing ships. Thousands of terminid bugs swarmed over the rocky ridges and poured into the valley, where the last defensive line of the Helldivers was crumbling into dust and blood. Izuku Midoriya stood on the vibrating metal ramp of the extraction shuttle, known as Pelican 1, and watched the disaster unfold with wide eyes that stung from the heat. The screaming of the dying soldiers mixed with the screeching of the insects and the roar of fire tornadoes that spun across the landscape. The pilot of the shuttle shouted over the comm system that they were leaving immediately because the weight of the enemy swarm was too great and the risk to the equipment was too high. Izuku looked at the tactical map on his wrist, which showed a small cluster of blue dots surrounded by a sea of red dots deep in the valley. Those were people down there who were still fighting and still breathing, but the standard procedure for Super Earth Command was to mark them as acceptable losses. The democracy officer on board the shuttle ordered the pilot to lift off and leave the Doom Squad to their fate so that the mission data could be saved. Izuku felt a familiar heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire tornadoes, and he felt a buzzing energy under his skin that felt like high-voltage electricity. He gripped the steel frame of the shuttle door so hard that the metal bent under his fingers and left deep grooves in the grey paint. He knew that the rules said he should stay on the ship, and he knew that a good soldier followed orders without thinking. But Izuku also knew that watching people die when he had the power to save them was something he could never live with. The glowing green lines that appeared on his armor were not standard issue, and they hummed with a sound that made the air around him vibrate. He ignored the furious orders screaming in his helmet earpiece, and he ignored the terror that made his stomach turn over. He took a deep breath of the scorching air and stepped off the ramp just as the shuttle engines flared to life to carry it to safety. He did not fall like a normal human being. He launched himself forward with a kick that cracked the rock beneath his boots and sent a shockwave through the dust that knocked a nearby soldier flat. He flew through the air faster than a drone and aimed straight for the center of the bug swarm that was tearing through the last sandbag wall. The green lightning sparked around his body and illuminated the dark battlefield like a flare. He landed in the middle of the chaos just as a massive charger bug rushed toward the wounded survivors who had run out of ammo. Izuku did not use a gun or a grenade or an orbital strike beacon. He pulled his right arm back and felt the power surge through his muscles until it felt like his bones might snap under the pressure. He yelled a word that no one on this planet had ever heard before and punched the giant armored bug right in the center of its head. The impact sounded like a cannon firing, and the force of the blow blew the giant monster apart in a shower of green blood and shell fragments. The wind from the punch knocked the other bugs backward and cleared a circle in the middle of the swarm. For a moment, the entire battlefield went silent as both the humans and the monsters looked at the boy who had just done the impossible with his bare hands. Izuku stood up from the crater he had made and held his broken right arm with his left hand, while he stared down the endless horde of enemies. The soldiers behind him stared at his back with fear and confusion, because they did not understand what they were seeing. The war for the galaxy had just changed forever, because a variable that Super Earth did not account for had just entered the equation, and the cost of this new power was going to be higher than anyone could imagine. The silence that followed the destruction of the charger bug lasted only for a heartbeat before the war resumed its screaming. Izuku Midoriya stood amidst the smoking green ruin of the monster he had just destroyed, and his breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of sulfur and burning oil. His right arm hung uselessly at his side, and the familiar throbbing pain of broken bones radiated from his hand all the way up to his shoulder, but he shoved the pain into a corner of his mind where he could ignore it. The soldiers behind him were frozen, not just by fear, but by a complete lack of context for what they were seeing, because in their world, biology did not explode with green lightning and teenagers did not punch tanks to death. The soldier closest to him was a heavy gunner whose armor was scorched black and whose machine gun was glowing red from overuse. This soldier stepped forward and raised his weapon not at the bugs, but at Izuku, because his training dictated that anything unidentifiable was a threat to liberty. Izuku saw the barrel raise and his danger sense flared like a spike in his skull, but he did not attack the soldier. He raised his good left hand in a placating gesture and shouted that he was human, and that he was on their side. The gunner hesitated because the sheer volume of terminid shrieks rising from the valley floor demanded his attention more than the strange boy. A fresh wave of scavengers and warriors crested the ridge and began to clatter down the slope like a landslide of chitin and claws. The democracy officer on the shuttle Pelican 1 screamed over the external speakers for the squad to board immediately or be left behind. The trance broke and the survival instinct kicked in for everyone at once. The gunner grabbed the collar of a wounded comrade and began dragging him up the ramp, while the other two survivors provided covering fire that did little more than annoy the approaching swarm. Izuku realized that the shuttle was their only way off this hellish rock, and he also realized that the bugs were moving faster than the wounded soldiers could run. He made a calculation in split seconds that weighed the durability of his own body against the speed of the enemy. He spun around to face the swarm and focused the power of one for all into his legs and his left arm. He could not use 100% again without risking permanent disability, but he could maintain a steady 20%, which was enough to outpace anything on 2 legs or 4. He activated Black Whip, and 6 tendrils of black energy erupted from his back and lashed out to grab the loose rocks and debris scattered around the landing zone. He swung the debris like flails and created a physical barrier between the retreating soldiers and the advancing horde. A warrior bug lunged at him with razor-sharp claws, and Izuku dodged under the strike and delivered a precise kick to its thorax that shattered its exoskeleton and sent it tumbling back into its kin. He was fighting not to win, but to buy time. He heard the heavy clank of boots hitting the metal deck of the shuttle and the whine of the engines increasing in pitch as the thrusters began to rotate for lift. The pilots shouted that they were taking off and the ramp began to close. Izuku looked back and saw the heavy gunner standing at the edge of the ramp and waving frantically for him to jump. The distance was 30 meters and the bugs were closing the gap from all sides. Izuku channeled power into his calves and felt the concrete beneath him crack as he launched himself into the air. He soared over the heads of the lead bugs and landed heavily on the edge of the closing ramp just as the shuttle lurched upward. He tumbled into the troop bay and the metal door sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss that cut off the sound of the screaming swarm. The interior of the shuttle was dark and smelled of sweat and antiseptic, and the roar of the engines vibrated through the floor plates. Izuku lay on the floor for a moment and clutched his broken arm while the green lightning faded from his skin. The 4 Helldivers in the bay stared at him with helmets that hid their faces, but their body language screamed tension. The heavy gunner leaned down and checked Izuku for weapons, but found only the tattered remains of his hero costume and the iron soles of his boots. The gunner asked who he was and what unit he belonged to, but the voice that came through the helmet's synthesizer was distorted and robotic. Izuku tried to sit up and explained that his name was Izuku Midoriya and that he was a hero, but the word seemed to confuse the soldiers. They looked at each other and then looked at the democracy officer, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat up front. The officer turned around and his helmet had a yellow stripe that marked his rank. He held a pistol in his hand and pointed it directly at Izuku's chest. He stated that there were no heroes in the galaxy, only Helldivers and citizens, and that unregistered psychic phenomena were a Class A treason. Izuku froze and realized that he was not in a place where misunderstandings could be cleared up with a smile and an apology. He was in a military environment that was rigid and paranoid. He slowly lowered his hands and said that he was lost and that he had just fought the bugs to save them. The heavy gunner put a hand on the officer's gun and lowered it slightly and said that the kid had saved their lives and that they should at least wait until they were back on the super destroyer to execute him. The officer hesitated and then holstered his weapon, but he kept his hand near it. He told the pilot to alert High Command that they were bringing in a biological anomaly. The shuttle broke through the atmosphere and the orange glare of the fire tornadoes faded into the blackness of space. Izuku looked out the small, thick window and saw a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. Hundreds of massive grey warships hung in the void above the planet, and their guns were firing continuous streams of laser fire and ballistic shells down onto the surface. It was a fleet of a magnitude he had never imagined, and the sheer industrial scale of the violence was overwhelming. These were not peacekeeping vessels or rescue ships. They were exterminators. The shuttle banked toward one of the ships, which had the name SES Prophet of Truth stenciled on its hull in white letters. The landing sequence was rough, and the shuttle slammed onto the flight deck with a jolt that rattled Izuku's teeth. The ramp opened and a squad of soldiers in pristine white armor with yellow capes was waiting for them. They did not offer medical aid. They surrounded Izuku with rifles raised and ordered him to kneel. Izuku complied because he was outnumbered and injured, and he needed to understand the rules of this world before he could act. A man in a long coat and a peaked cap walked through the circle of soldiers and looked down at Izuku with cold grey eyes. This was the shipmaster. He looked at Izuku's broken arm and then at the tactical tablet in his hand, which was playing a replay of the punch that killed the charger. The shipmaster asked if Izuku was a product of the dissident gene modification programs on Cyberstan. Izuku shook his head and said he came from Earth, but the shipmaster scoffed and said that Super Earth did not produce mutants. They clamped magnetic cuffs onto Izuku's wrists and hauled him to his feet. They marched him through the corridors of the ship, which were narrow and utilitarian and filled with the constant hum of machinery. There were no windows and no decorations, and every screen on the walls played a loop of patriotic speeches and warnings about thought crimes. They took him to a medical bay that looked more like a mechanic's workshop than a hospital. A robotic arm descended from the ceiling and scanned his body with a grid of red lasers. The medical droid announced in a flat voice that the subject had multiple fractures in the right humerus and radius, and that there was zero presence of element 710 in his bloodstream. This detail seemed to surprise the observers behind the glass wall. They had assumed he was part bug or part illuminant, but he was biologically human. The shipmaster spoke over the intercom and asked about the energy readings. The droid reported that the subject cells contained an unknown form of bioelectric storage that defied the laws of thermodynamics. The shipmaster ordered the droid to set the bone and administer a stim. The robotic arm extended a syringe and stabbed it into Izuku's neck without warning. The sensation was immediate and shocking. It wasn't like the healing quirk of Recovery Girl, which drained his stamina. This was a chemical rush that forced his body to ignore pain and knit tissues together at an accelerated rate that felt like burning. Izuku gasped and arched his back as the drugs flooded his system. His broken arm snapped and crunched as the bones realigned and the bruising faded in seconds. He was panting and sweating, but the pain was gone, replaced by a jittery aggression that made him want to run or fight. It was a combat drug, pure and simple. The door to the medical bay hissed open, and the democracy officer from the shuttle walked in. He was not wearing his helmet now, and his face was scarred and hard. He carried a chair and sat down opposite the examination table where Izuku was restrained. He introduced himself as Officer Kane. He told Izuku that the Ministry of Truth had reviewed the footage from the surface. He said that normally an unregistered mutant would be ejected out of the airlock immediately to preserve the genetic purity of humanity. However, the efficiency with which Izuku had dispatched the Terminid heavy unit had caught the attention of Strategic Command. Kane leaned forward and looked Izuku in the eye and asked him what he fought for. Izuku answered automatically that he fought to save people and to bring peace. Kane narrowed his eyes and asked what he meant by peace. Izuku talked about a world where people could smile without fear and where the strong protected the weak. Kane listened without interrupting, but his expression grew darker. He stood up and paced the small room. He told Izuku that peace was not a natural state. He said that the galaxy was a hostile place where every alien species wanted to eradicate humanity. He said that peace was only possible through superior firepower and the total subjugation of the enemy. He called it managed democracy. He explained that freedom was a burden that the state took upon itself so that citizens could be happy and productive. Izuku argued that forced peace wasn't real peace, but Kane slammed his hand on the metal table and shouted that hesitation was treason. He pointed to the screen on the wall, which showed a live feed of a colony being overrun by bugs. He asked Izuku if his ideals could stop those claws from tearing children apart. He asked if his moral high ground was worth the lives of the innocent. Izuku looked at the screen and felt a knot of conflict in his stomach. He knew the man was manipulating him, but he also knew that the threat was real. The bugs were mindless killing machines and talking to them was impossible. Kane saw the hesitation and pressed his advantage. He offered Izuku a choice. He could be executed as a dissident right now and his body recycled for fertilizer, or he could enlist as a Helldiver and use his power to protect humanity. He would be a probationary asset under constant surveillance. One step out of line, one act of sedition, and the explosive collar they were about to fit on his neck would detonate. Izuku looked at the collar in Kane's hand. It was a thick ring of black metal with a red light blinking on the side. He thought about his friends back home, and he thought about All Might. He was trapped in a universe that was cruel and uncompromising, but he could not sit in a cell while people died. He had to learn about this world and find a way back, and the only way to do that was to be out there. He nodded slowly. Kane smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes and clicked the collar around Izuku's neck. It hummed with a low frequency that vibrated against his vocal cords. Kane told him that his first evaluation mission would begin in 10 minutes. There was no training and no orientation. Helldivers learned in the fire. They gave him a black bodysuit that was made of a strange ballistic fiber and a yellow cape that felt heavy on his shoulders. They gave him a helmet, but he refused to wear it because he needed to see and hear clearly to use his danger sense. Kane allowed it because he wanted the other soldiers to see the boy's face so they would know he was different. They led him to the Hellpod Bay. It was a vast circular room filled with hundreds of pods ready to drop. Soldiers were climbing into them with grim resignation. Izuku was assigned to a squad that was preparing to drop into a sector called the Umlaut Sector. The mission was to retrieve a hard drive containing launch codes for an ICBM silo that had failed to fire. The area was classified as a suicide mission difficulty. The other 3 members of the squad were veterans. Their call signs were Apex, Breaker, and Roach. They looked at Izuku's lack of armor and the collar on his neck, and they knew exactly what he was. He was a suicide asset, a weapon to be used and discarded. They didn't speak to him. They just climbed into their pods. Izuku stood before his pod. It looked like a coffin. He stepped inside and the clamps locked his arms and legs. The door slid shut and he was in total darkness. The voice of the ship's AI announced the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The floor dropped away and the stomach-churning sensation of freefall hit him. He was falling from orbit inside a metal bullet. The heat of re-entry turned the air inside the pod into an oven. He could feel the shaking and the G-forces crushing his chest. Then the retro-rockets fired with a bone-jarring slam and the pod smashed into the ground. The hatch exploded outward and Izuku stumbled out into a nightmare. They had landed in a swamp. The air was thick with fog and spores that clogged the lungs. The water was waist-deep and black, and the trees were moving. No, they weren't trees. They were bile titans, massive, towering arachnids that stood 20 meters high. There were 3 of them surrounding the landing zone. His danger sense was screaming so loud it was blinding. Apex was the first to die. He stepped out of his pod and was immediately dissolved by a stream of acidic bile that melted his armor and flesh in seconds. Breaker and Roach opened fire with recoilless rifles, but the shells bounced off the thick chitin of the Titan's legs. Izuku knew that standard attacks wouldn't work. He needed to get high. He channeled 15% into his legs and jumped, using the thick trunks of the dead swamp trees as stepping stones. He moved like a green blur in the grey fog. He reached the height of the Titan's head and saw the soft green sacs underneath its abdomen where the bile was stored. It was a weak point. He remembered his training. Analyze, adapt. He spun in the air and activated a specialized move he had been working on. Delaware Smash. He flicked his fingers with 100% power, creating a compressed air blast that hit the bile sac like a physical projectile. The sac ruptured and the Titan screeched as its own acid ate it from the inside out. It collapsed into the swamp with a splash that sent a wave of mud over the squad. The other 2 Titans turned toward the source of the pain. Izuku landed in the water and felt the mud suck at his boots. He was surrounded. Roach shouted for him to run to the objective, but Izuku saw movement in the distance. It was a group of civilians, colonists who had been hiding in a bunker that was now exposed. The Titans were ignoring the soldiers and heading for the civilians because they were softer targets. The mission parameters flashed on Izuku's wrist display. Primary objective: retrieve hard drive. Secondary objective: none. The civilians were not part of the mission. In the logic of the Helldivers, they were acceptable collateral damage. The hard drive was the only thing that mattered because it could launch the nuke to clear the zone. Breaker yelled at Izuku to leave them and move to the objective. Kane's voice crackled in his earpiece, warning him that deviating from the mission was grounds for termination. Izuku looked at the terrified families huddled in the mud. He looked at the hard drive which was located in a building in the opposite direction. He remembered All Might's words. Meddling where you don't need to is the essence of being a hero. He gritted his teeth and grabbed the collar around his neck. If they blew his head off, so be it. He turned his back on the objective and sprinted toward the civilians. Kane screamed in his ear that he was violating direct orders. Izuku ignored him. He reached the civilians just as a pack of hunter bugs leaped from the shadows. He didn't have time to punch them all. He used Black Whip to grab 2 of the civilians and toss them into the relative safety of a shipping container. He kicked a hunter out of the air and used its body as a shield to block the claws of another. He was a whirlwind of motion, protecting the weak with a ferocity that stunned the surviving Helldivers. He wasn't fighting for democracy or for the map. He was fighting for the people standing behind him. He yelled at Breaker and Roach to cover him. The 2 soldiers were confused. They had never seen a Helldiver prioritize life over the mission. But the sight of the boy fighting an army alone triggered something in them. A buried instinct of humanity that the training hadn't quite erased. Roach cursed and swung his machine gun around to support Izuku. Breaker hesitated, then fired a rocket at the approaching bugs. They held the line. For 10 minutes, it was absolute chaos. Izuku's suit was torn, and he was bleeding from a dozen cuts, but he didn't fall. He moved the civilians, group by group, to the extraction beacon. He forced the squad to cool down the shuttle for the people, not the data. When the Pelican arrived, the pilot refused to land for civilians. Izuku leaped onto the hovering ship's wing and punched the glass of the cockpit, cracking it. He stared at the pilot with glowing green eyes and pointed down. The pilot, terrified by the sheer aura of pressure emanating from the boy, landed the bird. They loaded the civilians. Only then did Izuku turn back to the objective. The hard drive was surrounded by a fresh wave of bugs. The mission timer was at 0. The super destroyer was leaving low orbit. They had missed the window. They were stranded. The civilians were safe, but the mission was a failure. Kane's voice came over the comms, cold and deadly. He said the failure to extract the data meant the sector was lost. He said Izuku had traded a strategic victory for a few useless lives. He prepared to detonate the collar. Izuku stood in the swamp, watching the shuttle fly away with the families. He felt the collar heat up. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But the explosion didn't come. Instead, Kane's voice spoke again. He said that the telemetry showed the civilians were scientists from a weapons research division. High Command had just updated their value. Izuku had accidentally saved high-value assets. The mission was retroactively classified as a success. A second extraction shuttle was inbound for the squad. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and fell to his knees in the mud. He wasn't dead, but he had learned a terrifying lesson. In this world, doing the right thing was only allowed if it was profitable. He looked at his hands, covered in alien blood. He had survived the first contact, but the war was just beginning. He climbed onto the second shuttle as the sun began to rise over the swamp, illuminating the carnage. He sat opposite Roach and Breaker. They didn't look at him with scorn anymore. They looked at him with something else. Fear, respect. It was hard to tell, but they knew one thing. The kid was not a soldier. He was something else entirely. And that made him dangerous to everyone, including himself. As the shuttle lifted off, Izuku looked back at the planet. He had saved 20 people, but millions more were dying. He needed to get stronger. He needed to understand the enemy. and he needed to find a way to change the rules of this game before it turned him into a monster too. The shuttle docked with the Prophet of Truth. Izuku walked down the ramp, his head held high. Officer Kane was waiting for him. Kane didn't smile. He just pointed to the next mission briefing on the wall. The liberation of Malevolent Creek, the robot Vietnam. Izuku tightened his fists. He was ready. The jump to the Severin sector was different from the frantic scramble of the bug front, because the silence on the bridge of the SES Prophet of Truth was heavy and suffocating. Izuku stood by the viewing port as the ship decelerated from faster-than-light travel, and the planet of Malevolent Creek rotated into view, like a bruised purple fruit rotting in the void. There were no orange fires here, and no bright blue skies, but only a swirling shroud of dark clouds and an endless twilight that hid the surface from the naked eye. The tactical map on the wall was a sea of red zones, and the casualty counter for the sector was spinning so fast that the last 3 digits were a blur of motion. Officer Kane stood behind the mission console and briefed the new squad that Izuku had been assigned to, and his voice was devoid of the patriotic fervor he had used before. This was not a crusade for expansion, but a desperate holding action against an enemy that did not feel fear or pain or exhaustion. The enemy was the Automaton Collective, and they were a relentless tide of steel and socialism that sought to dismantle the very concept of liberty. Izuku looked at his new squadmates who were gathered around the equipment rack checking their weapons with obsessive care. They were not the fresh-faced recruits from the bug front, but survivors who had been fighting in the creek for weeks, which in Helldiver time was equivalent to decades. The squad leader was a woman, with the call sign Banshee, who wore armor that was scraped down to the bare metal and covered in tally marks scratched with a knife. She did not look at Izuku when she spoke, but addressed the air in front of her. She said that they did not need a hero, and they did not need a mutant, and they only needed someone who could draw fire so they could reload. The other 2 members were heavy weapons specialists named Rook and Jester, who carried autocannons and recoilless rifles that looked too heavy for normal humans to lift. They looked at Izuku's lack of armor and the explosive collar on his neck and shook their heads with grim amusement. Banshee told Izuku that the bots were not like the bugs because the bugs wanted to eat you, but the bots wanted to replace you. She warned him that if he saw a red light in the trees, he was already dead. The mission was a search and destroy operation targeting a heavy fabricator facility deep in the jungle that was producing the new Devastator models. They were to drop in, plant a hell bomb, and extract before the dropship swamped them. It sounded simple, but the tension in the room suggested otherwise. Izuku walked to his pod, and the collar on his neck felt tighter than before, as if it was reacting to his rising heart rate. He stepped into the pod and the darkness took him again. The drop was violent and turbulent as the pods punched through the thick ion storms that covered the planet. Lightning struck the pod casing and fried the internal sensors, so Izuku dropped blind until the retro thrusters fired and slammed him into the mud. The hatch blew open, and the first thing that hit him was the smell of ozone and wet earth, and the sound of rain drumming on the metal debris that littered the forest floor. It was dark, a perpetual gloom illuminated only by the glowing flora and the distant flashes of orbital lasers. Izuku stepped out and immediately sank to his shins in the purple mud. Danger sense did not flare, but it hummed with a constant low-level headache that indicated he was surrounded by hostility in every direction. Banshee's voice crackled over the comms and ordered them to form a wedge formation and move toward the objective, which was 2 clicks north. Izuku took point because he was the disposable asset. He moved through the strange alien jungle with his senses dialed to the maximum. The trees here were thick and twisted, and their leaves were a dark metallic blue that seemed to absorb the light. He heard a sound that was not natural. It was a rhythmic chanting that sounded like a distorted synthesizer playing a march. It was coming from the fog ahead. Izuku raised his hand to signal a halt, but a red laser bolt hissed through the air and struck the tree next to his head with a sound like tearing canvas. The wood exploded into embers and the jungle erupted. The air was suddenly filled with red tracer fire that crisscrossed the darkness like a laser grid. Izuku dove behind a fallen log and saw them for the first time. They were skeletons of metal with glowing red eyes, and they marched in perfect unison through the undergrowth. There were dozens of them, standard troopers carrying laser rifles and rocket launchers. Behind them came the larger shapes of devastators, hulking armored bipeds that walked with a heavy stomp that shook the ground. Izuku felt a spike of fear that was colder and sharper than what he felt with the bugs. The bugs were animals acting on instinct. These things were calculating. They suppressed the squad's position with disciplined fire while their flankers moved to encircle. Rook and Jester opened up with their heavy weapons, and the auto-cannon rounds tore through the lead robots with satisfying crunches of metal. Banshee screamed for Izuku to push forward and break their line. Izuku knew he couldn't just punch them all because they were shooting back. He needed cover. He activated the smokescreen quirk, which he had barely used since unlocking it. Purple smoke billowed from his body and mixed with the jungle fog to create a thick wall of opacity that blocked the enemy's visual sensors. The laser fire became sporadic and inaccurate. Izuku used the confusion to sprint forward. He channeled One for All into his legs and zigzagged through the trees. He reached the front line of the trooper bots and unleashed a flurry of low-power air blasts that knocked them off their feet. He didn't try to punch the metal directly because he knew his bones were still healing from the bug fight. Instead, he grabbed the barrel of a trooper's rifle and used the robot's own momentum to swing it into the path of a rocket fired by another bot. The explosion shredded 3 of the machines. Izuku was moving like a ghost in the smoke. He was not destroying them with brute force, but dismantling their formation with precision. He kicked the knee joints of the devastators to make them collapse, and then ripped the power cables from their necks. He was efficient and brutal. The squad watched from their cover with stunned silence as the boy cleared the ambush in less than a minute. The smoke cleared, and the jungle was quiet again, save for the sparking of severed wires. Banshee walked up to a twitching robot chassis and put a bullet in its central processor to ensure it was dead. She looked at Izuku, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her voice. She said that they needed to keep moving before the dropships arrived. They pushed deeper into the jungle and the resistance grew stiffer. They encountered scout striders, which were piloted by thin skeletal bots, and heavy tanks with turret cannons that could vaporize a Helldiver in one shot. Izuku learned quickly that his danger sense was the only thing keeping him alive. It warned him of sniper shots a split second before they fired. It warned him of landmines buried in the mud. He became the squad's radar. He would shout warnings and point out targets before the others even saw them. They began to trust him. They stopped treating him like a mine detector and started treating him like a teammate. They shared their ammo packs with him even though he had no gun, because they realized he needed the supplies to patch his suit. They reached the objective after 2 hours of hell. The Fabricator Fortress was a massive complex of black metal walls and smoking chimneys that spewed pollution into the sky. It was guarded by a wall of turrets and a battalion of bots. In the center of the base stood a jammer tower that was blocking their ability to call in orbital strikes or the extraction shuttle. They were cut off. Banshee laid out the plan. They had to infiltrate the base and manually disable the jammer so they could cool down the hell bomb. It was a suicide run. Izuku looked at the walls and saw a vent higher up on the main factory building. He told Banshee he could get in there and disable the jammer from the inside while they drew the fire at the main gate. Banshee hesitated. It was against protocol to split the squad, but she knew it was their only chance. She nodded and gave him a satchel of high explosives. She told him to be fast or they would all die. Izuku nodded and vanished into the shadows. He used Black Whip to scale the outer wall, moving silently between the sweeping searchlights. He reached the vent and tore the grate off with a burst of strength. He crawled into the facility. The inside was a nightmare of industrial noise and heat. Assembly lines were churning out robot soldiers by the hundred. Izuku saw human bodies being used as batteries, hooked up to machines that drained their bioelectricity to power the fabricators. The horror of it almost made him vomit. This was not war. This was harvesting. He forced himself to keep moving. He reached the control room for the jammer and saw a terminal guarded by a Hulk, a massive dreadnought with a flamethrower arm and a buzzsaw arm. The room was too small to dodge. Izuku had to end it fast. He channeled 45% of One for All, ignoring the warning pain in his limbs. He leaped from the catwalk and came down on the Hulk like a meteor. He smashed his heel into the heat vent on the back of the Hulk's armor, which was its only weak spot. The machine exploded, and the shockwave threw Izuku into the console. He planted the explosives and set the timer for 30 seconds. He scrambled back up the vent as the alarm klaxons began to scream. He jumped from the wall just as the control room detonated. The jammer tower groaned and collapsed, crashing into the factory below. The stratagem signal on his wrist turned green. He shouted into the comms that the jammer was down. Banshee's voice came back filled with relief and adrenaline. She called down the hell bomb and the extraction shuttle simultaneously. But then, the catastrophe began. The sky above them split open, not with the arrival of the shuttle, but with the arrival of an automaton dropship of a size they had never seen before. It was a factory strider, a walking fortress the size of a city block. It landed in the middle of the base and crushed the hell bomb beacon before it could deploy. Its top-mounted cannons swiveled and fired a blast that vaporized Jester where he stood. There was nothing left of him, just a crater and a drifting yellow cape. Rook screamed and fired his autocannon at the beast's legs, but the rounds bounced off harmlessly. The Strider's chin-mounted Gatling lasers spun up and shredded the cover where Banshee and Rook were hiding. Izuku watched from the wall as his squad was pinned down by overwhelming firepower. He was safe up there. He could run into the jungle and wait for the cooldown to cool the shuttle elsewhere, but he saw Banshee dragging Rook's body behind a rock. She was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her side. She looked up at Izuku on the wall and made a cutting motion across her throat. She was ordering him to leave, to save the mission data. Izuku froze. The logic of the Helldivers was cold calculus. Bend lives to buy objectives, but the logic of a hero was different. Izuku remembered the words of his mentor, "You can become a hero." He looked at the massive factory strider and he looked at his dying squad. He made a choice that defied all tactical sense. He did not run away. He jumped down. He landed directly in front of the strider, a tiny green speck against a mountain of grey steel. The machine's sensors locked onto him. The Gatling lasers spun. Izuku took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He reached deep into the core of One for All and felt the vestiges of the past users. He needed something more than strength. He needed speed. He needed gear shift. He felt the reality around him slow down as he activated the second user's quirk. The lasers fired, But Izuku was already gone. He moved faster than sound, a green streak that broke the sound barrier with a thunderclap that shattered the windows of the factory. He ran up the leg of the factory strider, defying gravity. He dodged the defensive turrets on the machine's belly. He reached the undercarriage where the fabricator doors were opening to deploy more devastators. He threw himself inside the machine. He was inside the belly of the beast. It was dark and filled with the heat of the reactor. He saw the glowing blue core that powered the walker. It was shielded, but shields could be broken. He didn't have explosives left. He only had his body. He wound up his right arm, the one that had been healed by the stims, and poured everything he had left into it. 100%. Detroit smash. He punched the reactor shielding. The impact was so great that it buckled the metal plating of the walker from the inside. The core destabilized. A critical warning siren shrieked. Izuku grabbed a loose cable and swung himself out of the bay doors, just as the reactor went critical. He hit the ground and rolled, covering his head. The factory strider exploded with the force of a tactical nuke. The shockwave flattened the jungle for a kilometer in every direction. Izuku was tossed like a rag doll into the mud. His ears were ringing and his vision was blurry. He tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't work. He crawled toward where Banshee and Rook had been. The smoke was clearing. He found them. Rook was dead, his chest cavity gone. Banshee was alive, but barely. Her legs were trapped under a slab of concrete. She looked at Izuku with eyes that were wide with shock. She coughed up blood and laughed a wet, gurgling laugh. She asked him what kind of monster he was. Izuku didn't answer. He started to dig. He pulled the concrete off her legs with groans of exertion. He picked her up. She was light, too light. He carried her toward the extraction zone. The Pelican was descending, its engines roaring. The pilot called out that the landing zone was hot. More bots were coming. A sea of red eyes in the fog. Izuku didn't stop. He walked through the laser fire that burned his suit and grazed his skin. He didn't feel it. He was numb. He walked up the ramp and laid Banshee down on the seat. He collapsed next to her. The shuttle lifted off, leaving the burning ruin of the factory behind. Izuku looked at Banshee. She was staring at the ceiling of the shuttle. Her eyes were glassy. She whispered that they were just ammo. That's all they were, spent casings. Then she stopped breathing. Izuku sat there as the shuttle climbed into orbit. He watched the chest of the woman who had saved his life stop moving. He was the only survivor. Again. The shuttle docked with the Prophet of Truth. The medical team rushed in and took Banshee's body away without a word. They didn't salute. They didn't mourn. They just cleared the deck for the next load. Officer Kane was there. He looked at Izuku, who was covered in mud, oil, and the blood of his squad. Kane didn't look angry. He looked impressed. He handed Izuku a tablet. It was a transfer order. Kane said that High Command had reviewed the telemetry. They saw a single unit destroy a factory strider. They didn't care about the squad. They didn't care about the rescue. They cared that they had found a super weapon. Kane told Izuku that he was being promoted to the Skull Admiral's personal task force. He said it was an honor. Izuku looked at the tablet and then at the empty seats where Banshee, Rook, and Jester had sat. He felt a coldness settling in his heart that had nothing to do with the temperature. He realized that in this universe, being a hero didn't mean saving everyone. It meant being the most efficient killer on the battlefield. The victory music played over the ship's speakers. It sounded like a funeral dirge. Izuku stood up and his legs trembled not from weakness, but from rage. He accepted the tablet. He would play their game. He would go where they sent him. But he wasn't doing it for Super Earth anymore. He was doing it because every robot he destroyed was one less monster that could hurt someone else. He was beginning to understand the hate, the relentless driving hate that fueled the Helldivers. But where they hated the enemy, Izuku was beginning to hate the command that spent them like copper coins. He walked to the armory to repair his suit. He needed to be ready. The war wasn't stopping. And neither was he. The screen on the wall flashed a new update. The Terminid control system had failed. The bugs were mutating. Flying Terminids had been spotted. The gloom of the creek was replaced by the terror of the skies. Izuku didn't flinch. He just tightened his gloves. Let them come. The transition from the calculated mechanical horror of the automaton front to the chaotic biological nightmare of the Terminid quarantine zone was jarring enough to induce vertigo. Izuku Midoriya stood on the bridge of the SES Song of Judgment, which was a ship significantly larger and more heavily armed than the Prophet of Truth. He was no longer wearing the tattered standard-issue armor of a cadet, but a customized suit that High Command had fabricated based on his combat data. It was sleek and green, with gold accents that mocked his original hero costume, but it was lined with heavy ceramic plates and integrated with stim injectors that fed directly into his spine. He was part of the Crimson Squad now, which was a unit that did not officially exist on the public record. They were the Cleaners. The squad leader was a man named Commander Graves, who wore armor so thick he looked like a walking tank, and who spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding gravel. The other two members were Viper and Echo, who were specialists in chemical warfare and demolition respectively. They did not welcome Izuku with hazing or camaraderie, but with a silent professional acknowledgement that he was a useful asset who had survived statistically impossible odds. The mission briefing was projected onto the holotable, and it showed the planet Meridia. It had once been a beautiful jungle world, but now it was a pulsing ball of brown and orange rot. The Terminid control system, which was supposed to gas the bugs into extinction with a chemical called termicide, had failed catastrophically. Instead of killing the bugs, the gas had forced them to mutate at a rate that defied evolutionary science. The planet was now a super colony. The objective was not to save the colonists because there were no colonists left. The objective was to descend into the heart of the infestation and retrieve the black box data from the central TCS tower before the planet was glassed by the orbital fleet. It was a salvage mission for political cover to hide the extent of the failure from the citizens of Super Earth. Izuku looked at the holographic map and saw the density of the swarm. It was not a collection of dots. It was a solid ocean of red. He felt the phantom pain in his arm and the weight of the collar on his neck, which had been upgraded to a newer model that was tamper-proof and linked directly to Graves's biomonitor. If Graves died, the collar detonated. It was a failsafe to ensure the asset protected the commander. They moved to the hellpods without speeches. The atmosphere on the ship was tense because even these veterans knew that Meridia was a death sentence. Izuku stepped into his pod and the familiar claustrophobia set in. The launch was silent until the explosive decompression of the tube. They fell toward the planet, and as they pierced the cloud layer, the viewports of the pods were obscured not by rain or smoke, but by wings. Thousands of leathery translucent wings. The mutation had birthed shriekers, flying bugs that swarmed like bats and dove with the force of kinetic missiles. Izuku's danger sense went white hot. It was not a buzz or a sting, but a constant blinding pressure in his skull. The pod smashed into a rocky plateau overlooking the TCS tower, which rose into the sky like a skeletal finger, wrapped in alien fungus. Izuku kicked the hatch open and immediately rolled to avoid a diving shrieker that shattered the rock where he had been standing. The air was filled with a high-pitched screeching that drowned out the roar of the wind. Graves was already firing his primary weapon, which was an explosive diligence counter-sniper rifle that turned the flying bugs into mists of yellow ichor. Viper was spraying the ground with a flamethrower that burned with a white-hot chemical intensity, creating a perimeter of fire. Echo was calling down support weapons. Izuku did not have a gun. He did not need one. He looked up at the sky, which was darkened by the swarm. He realized that fighting on the ground was suicide. He needed to control the air. He tapped into the stockpile of One for All and reached for the quirk that he had been afraid to use in the cramped corridors of the bot factories. Float, he felt the gravity release its hold on his body. He pushed off the ground with 5% power and soared upward. The sensation of flight was usually liberating, but here it was terrifying. He was entering the domain of the enemy. The Shriekers saw the lone figure rising to meet them and converged. Dozens of them dove at once. Izuku spun in the air and activated Black Whip. The black tendrils shot out and lashed around the bodies of the nearest bugs. He yanked them violently, crashing them into each other with bone-breaking force. He used their bodies as anchors to swing himself higher and higher until he was above the main swarm. He looked down and saw his squad pinned on the plateau by a river of warrior bugs climbing the cliffs. He had to clear the sky so they could move. He channeled 45% into his right leg. He spun vertically, creating a wheel of momentum. Manchester smash. He brought his heel down on the air itself, compressing it into a shockwave that blasted downward like a hammer from God. The air pressure slammed into the flock of Shriekers and crushed their hollow bones instantly. Hundreds of them fell from the sky like rain, clearing a cylinder of empty space around the squad. Graves's voice crackled in Izuku's ear. He didn't say good job. He said move to the objective. Izuku dropped back down, landing heavily next to Echo, who was reloading a recoilless rifle. They pushed forward toward the tower. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that squirmed under their boots. Spore spewers dotted the landscape, pumping a thick yellow fog into the air that reduced visibility to zero. Izuku used his Black Whip to clear the path, tearing the spewers out of the ground by their roots. They reached the base of the tower and found the entrance blocked by a growth of resin that was as hard as concrete. Viper stepped forward and doused the barrier in acid from a canister on his back. The resin hissed and melted, revealing a dark corridor that led into the bowels of the machine. The inside of the tower was worse than the outside. The metal walls were covered in pulsating eggs. The termicide pipes were leaking a green gas that made Izuku's skin itch even through his suit. They reached the control room, and Echo began to hack the terminal to download the data. Izuku stood guard at the door, his eyes scanning the shadows. He saw something on the wall, a logo of the company that made the termicide. Below it was a warning label that was partially obscured by slime. He wiped it away. It read, "Caution. Mutagenic properties detected in prolonged exposure." High Command knew. They knew the gas would mutate the bugs. They used it anyway because it was cheaper than conventional extermination. Izuku felt a surge of nausea that wasn't from the gas. He looked at Graves. He asked the commander if he knew. Graves didn't look up from his guard position. He said that the economy required E710 to function. Faster reproduction meant more oil. The mutation was a calculated risk to increase yields. It just went out of control. Izuku stared at him. They had turned a planet into a hellscape for profit. They were feeding soldiers into a meat grinder to harvest fuel. The data drive finished downloading. Echo pulled it out and secured it in a reinforced case. Graves ordered the extraction, but the bugs had other plans. The floor beneath them shook violently. The metal grating buckled and tore apart. A massive shape erupted from the depths of the tower. It was not a bile titan. It was something new. A bile spewer, but colossal, swollen with volatile gases, glowing with a radioactive green light. It was a nursing spewer, a queen of sorts. It blocked the exit. Its mouth opened and it spewed a stream of acid that filled the corridor. Viper screamed as the acid hit him. His armor melted instantly. He didn't even have time to inject a stim. He dissolved into a puddle of organic sludge in seconds. Graves didn't hesitate. He fired a grenade into the ceiling, causing a collapse that blocked the acid, but also trapped them in the room with the monster. There was no way out. The monster roared and the sound shattered the glass of the monitors. Izuku looked at the beast, and then at the only other exit, which was a ventilation shaft high on the wall. It was too small for Graves in his heavy armor. Graves saw it too. He looked at Izuku. He took the data drive from Echo's hands. He handed it to Izuku. He told him to go. Izuku refused. He said he could carry them. He could use Black Whip. Graves shook his head. He pointed to the collar. He said that if Izuku didn't leave, he would detonate the collar and kill them all anyway. He said the data was the mission. The soldiers were expendable. Izuku looked at the man, who was calmly accepting his death to protect a lie. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the collar off, but he couldn't. He grabbed the drive. He used Black Whip to pull himself into the vent. He looked back one last time. He saw Graves and Echo priming their grenades. He saw them charge the monster. The explosion rocked the tower, and the shockwave pushed Izuku through the vent and out onto the exterior gantry. He was alone again. The tower was collapsing. The structural integrity was gone. The sky was still full of shriekers. He had the data that proved the government was guilty of creating this nightmare. He had to get it to the extraction point. He activated the distress beacon. Pelican 1 acknowledged. ETA. 2 minutes. The plateau was swarming. A bile titan crested the ridge, then another, then a third. They were hunting him. Izuku strapped the data drive to his chest. He stood on the edge of the gantry. He was tired, so tired. The power of One for All felt heavy in his veins. The voices of the past users were silent. They had no advice for a world this broken. He closed his eyes and focused on the rhythm of his breathing. He didn't need to win. He just needed to survive for 2 minutes. He opened his eyes and they glowed with a feral intensity. He jumped. He didn't aim for the ground. He aimed for the lead titan. He landed on its head. He didn't punch it. He grabbed its sensory antennae with his bare hands and pulled. He steered the beast like a chariot. He forced it to turn and spray its acid at the second titan. The monsters fought each other, confused by the tiny aggressor riding them. Izuku jumped from the dying titan to the third one. He used Black Whip to bind its legs together. It crashed to the ground. The pelican roared overhead. The pilot shouted that he couldn't land because of the shriekers. Izuku looked up. He had one move left. A move he had seen All Might do in old videos. A move that changed the weather. He charged 100% into his right arm. He aimed at the sky. Fierce winds began to gather around him. He screamed the name of a city that didn't exist in this universe. Detroit smash. The punch didn't hit anything solid. It hit the atmosphere. The displacement of air was so massive that it created a localized vacuum. The clouds were blown apart. The shriekers were sucked into the vortex and pulverized. The sky cleared for a split second. The pelican dropped. Izuku sprinted for the ramp. He dove inside as the bugs overran the landing zone. The shuttle lifted off. Izuku sat on the floor, gasping for air. His arm was purple and useless. He clutched the data drive. He had done it. He had the truth. The shuttle docked with the Song of Judgment. Izuku expected to be taken to the bridge. He expected to give the data to the Admiral. Instead, he was met by a squad of democracy officers. They were wearing black armor with red visors. They didn't ask for the drive. They took it. One of them, a high-ranking officer named Marshall, looked at Izuku. He said that Commander Graves had reported the mission failure before he died. He said the data was corrupted and useless. Izuku stared at him. He said that was a lie. He said he saw the files. He saw the warning labels. Marshall smiled. He said that stress and trauma often cause hallucinations. He said that Izuku was a hero for retrieving the corrupted drive anyway, because it allowed them to calibrate the next batch of termicide. Izuku realized then that there was no exposing the truth. The system was too big. The lie was too essential. If he spoke out, he would disappear. And if he disappeared, he couldn't save anyone. He swallowed his rage. He swallowed the truth. He nodded. Marshall patted him on the shoulder. He said that Izuku was becoming a true Helldiver. He said they had a new assignment for him. The failure at Midoriya had caused a chain reaction. The bugs were spreading to the barrier planets, but there was a bigger threat. The automatons had launched a massive invasion fleet. They were targeting Cyberstan. They were calling it the Reclamation. Izuku was to be transferred to the X-45 sector, to a frozen wasteland. Marshall told him that his performance had earned him a new title. They were no longer calling him Cadet Midoriya. They were calling him the Green Ghost, a myth, a weapon. Izuku walked to his quarters. He took off his helmet and looked in the mirror. His eyes were dull. The light of the hero was fading, replaced by the cold calculation of a soldier. He looked at his hand. He flexed his fingers. He could still feel the phantom sensation of holding Graves's hand before the explosion. He realized that in this universe, you didn't save everyone. You didn't even save yourself. You only saved the mission. And the mission was a lie. But the people on the colonies, they were real. And as long as they were real, he had to keep fighting. Even if he was fighting for the villains. He lay down on his bunk and stared at the metal ceiling. He wondered if all might would have broken by now. He wondered if Shigaraki would have fit in better here. The ship jumped to hyperspace. The stars streaked by. Izuku closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. He needed to rest, because tomorrow he had to kill robots in the snow, and he had to do it better than anyone else, because he was the Green Ghost, and Ghost didn't die. The arrival in the Valdez sector was a shock to the system in every conceivable way. The heat of Midoriya was replaced by a cold so absolute that it froze the moisture in the air into diamond dust. The planet was Vandalan 4, a frozen rock that served as a critical listening post for the Federation. Their Automaton fleet had arrived in force. The sky was not black but red, illuminated by the thousands of dropships descending from the orbit. Izuku stood in the hangar bay of the SES Song of Judgment, which had joined the massive defensive armada. The bay was chaotic. Mechanics were welding armor plates onto walkers, soldiers were loading pallets of ammunition, and the PA system was blaring continuous alerts about hull breaches and boarding parties. Izuku was checking the seals on his new winterized suit, which was white with green accents to blend into the snow. He had been assigned to a new squad again. This was the pattern now. Squads were temporary. He was the constant. The new squad was called Wolfpack. They were marksmen, snipers. They didn't fight on the front lines. They hunted from the ridges. The leader was a man called Scope. He didn't speak much. He just pointed at the map. The mission was to provide overwatch for a convoy of civilian transports evacuating the capital city. The bots had set up a blockade. Wolfpack had to break it. They dropped into a blizzard. The wind was howling at hurricane speeds. Visibility was less than 10 meters. Izuku's danger sense was confused by the storm. The threat was everywhere and nowhere. They landed on a mountain peak overlooking the valley, where the convoy would pass. They set up their positions. Scope and the other two snipers, Ghost and Longshot, deployed their anti-material rifles. They lay prone in the snow, invisible. Izuku was the spotter. He didn't have a sniper rifle. He had his eyes and his mobility. He crouched on a rock and scanned the valley below. He saw the convoy approaching, heavy trucks laden with shivering colonists. And then he saw the ambush. In the snowdrifts ahead of the convoy, the red eyes of automaton troopers were glowing, hundreds of them, buried in the snow, waiting. Izuku whispered the coordinates to Scope. Scope fired. The round traveled 3 kilometers and took the head off a devastator. The ambush was triggered. The bots erupted from the snow. The valley turned into a shooting gallery. The convoy was taking fire. The lead truck exploded. Izuku watched the people spill out into the snow. He saw a child running. He saw a Hulk charging the child. The distance was too great for him to jump. He screamed at Scope to shoot the Hulk. Scope fired. The round ricocheted off the Hulk's armor. It was too thick. The Hulk raised its flamethrower. Izuku felt time stop. He couldn't reach them. He was useless up here. He made a choice. He ignored the mission parameters. He ignored the safety of the high ground. He jumped off the mountain. It was a 3-kilometer drop. He angled his body like a skydiver. He used float to adjust his trajectory. He fell through the blizzard like a meteor. He aimed for the Hulk. He didn't have enough charge for a 100% smash without breaking his legs on impact. He had to be creative. He used Black Whip to snag a passing dropship in midair. He swung around it, gaining speed. He released the whip and launched himself horizontally at the ground. He hit the snow with a rolling impact that created a trench. He popped up right in front of the Hulk. The robot paused, its sensors processing the sudden arrival. That second was enough. Izuku didn't punch. He touched the Hulk's chest plate. He channeled One for All into his fingers. Fajin. He had been charging it up during the fall. Kinetic energy stored and released. He unleashed a focused blast that punched a hole straight through the robot's chassis. The Hulk fell backward. The child was staring at him. Izuku didn't smile. He grabbed the child and threw him into the nearest truck. He turned to face the army. "Get moving," he screamed at the convoy driver. The trucks roared past him. Izuku stood alone in the middle of the road. The wolf pack was providing cover fire from the mountain, picking off targets, but they couldn't stop the wave. A factory strider emerged from the blizzard. It was darker and meaner than the one on the creek. It had anti-air batteries on its back. It looked at Izuku. Izuku looked at it. He was tired of running. He was tired of hiding. He felt the power of the third user. F.A. Jin. He felt the power of the second user. Gear shift. He felt the raw power of the stockpile. He combined them. He entered a state he had never achieved before, a state of pure energy flow. Full cowl, overdrive. His hair stood up, glowing white. The lightning around him turned from green to a blinding gold. He moved. He didn't run. He vanished. He appeared on top of the factory strider. He stomped his foot. The strider collapsed as his legs were crushed by the sudden increase in gravity. He appeared in the middle of a squad of berserkers. He spun, and the air pressure tore them apart. He was a force of nature. He was the storm. For 5 minutes, Izuku Midoriya was the strongest being in the galaxy. He destroyed a battalion of machines with his bare hands. The convoy escaped. The valley was silent except for the crackling of burning metal. The golden light faded. Izuku fell to his knees in the snow. His body was screaming. His muscles were torn. He coughed, and there was blood in the snow. He looked up. A dropship was descending. Not a bot ship, a pelican. But it wasn't coming for him. It was landing near the wreckage of the Strider. A team of scientists in hazard suits got out. They ignored Izuku. They ran to the wreckage. They started cutting pieces of the robot's armor. They were harvesting technology. Izuku watched them. A man in a suit walked over to him. It was Marshall again. He looked at Izuku's broken body. "Excellent field test," Marshall said. "The new stimulants are working perfectly." Izuku realized then the vitamins they had been giving him, the supplements in his food, they weren't just nutrients. They were experimental combat drugs designed to force his quirk to evolve. They were turning him into a biological weapon. They had engineered this situation to test his limits. The convoy was bait. The child was bait. Izuku tried to stand, to punch Marshall, to do something. But his body wouldn't obey. The drugs had a crash. He was paralyzed. Marshall smiled. "Don't worry, Asset. We have much bigger plans for you. The Illuminates are returning and we need a god to fight them." Two soldiers picked Izuku up and dragged him onto the shuttle. He watched the snow cover the battlefield. He had saved the convoy, but he had lost his soul. He was theirs now, completely. The shuttle lifted off, heading for the darkness of space. Izuku closed his eyes and a single tear froze on his cheek. He was the green ghost, and the ghost was trapped in the machine. The war escalated. Planets burned, and Izuku slept in his cryopod, dreaming of a world where heroes smiled, and where peace wasn't a lie written in oil and blood. The hiss of a cryo chamber sealing shut, locking the weapon away until the next apocalypse was scheduled. The screen faded to black, leaving only the blinking red light of the collar in the darkness. The cryopod hissed open with a sound like a dying breath, and the cold air of the awakening chamber hit Izuku Midoriya with the force of a physical blow. He did not gasp this time because his lungs had long ago stopped reacting to the shock of sudden resurrection. He simply opened his eyes and stared at the frosted glass of the pod lid until the hydraulic seals disengaged and lifted the barrier away. He sat up slowly, and the movement was accompanied by the grinding pop of joints that had been frozen for an indeterminate amount of time. He looked at his hands and saw that the scars were white and old, and that the skin was papery and thin. He did not know what year it was. He did not know how long he had been asleep. The last thing he remembered was the snow of Vandalon IV and the face of the man who had drugged him. Now he was in a room that was cleaner and more sterile than any ship he had been on before. A robotic arm descended from the ceiling and offered him a nutrient paste, which he accepted without thought. He ate mechanically while his eyes scanned the room. There were other pods, but they were empty. He was alone. A screen on the wall flickered to life and displayed the seal of the Ministry of Truth, but the colors were slightly wrong. The gold was too bright and the blue was too deep. A voice spoke from the speakers, and it was not the gravelly voice of a commander or the shouting of a drill sergeant. It was a smooth, synthetic voice that sounded almost maternal. It welcomed him back to the land of the living and informed him that he had been in stasis for 3 years. 3 years. The war should have been over, or lost. But the voice continued and said that the galaxy was in a state of perilous equilibrium, and that his unique talents were required for a threat that had been prophesied, but never confirmed until now. The Illuminate had returned. The ancient enemy of Super Earth, the squid-like telepaths who had been banished in the First Galactic War, had emerged from the dark space beyond the galactic rim. They were not invading with fleets of crude warships or swarms of biological monsters. They were invading with ideas. They were invading with light. Izuku stood up, and the floor felt cold against his bare feet. A locker opened automatically to reveal his gear. It was not the armor he remembered. It was a suit of matte black material that absorbed the light, sleek and featureless except for the glowing green lines of the circuitry that would amplify his quirk. There was no cape. Capes were for heroes. This was a suit for an assassin. He put it on and felt the familiar weight of the explosive collar settle around his neck. It was tighter now, fused directly to the suit's gorget. He picked up the helmet and looked at the black visor. He didn't recognize the person reflected in it. He put it on, and the HUD flared to life. Target: Squirrelby Shrine. Objective: silence the voice. The drop was silent. There were no other Helldivers. He was being deployed alone. The ship he dropped from was a stealth corvette, small and invisible to radar. He fell through the atmosphere of the planet and saw a world that defied the grim industrial logic of the rest of the galaxy. The sky was a swirling nebula of violets and indigos, and the ground was a geometric landscape of white crystal and flowing water. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen, and that made the dread in his stomach even heavier. Beauty in this universe was a trap. He landed on a circular platform floating above a silver ocean. The impact was cushioned by the suit's gravity dampeners. He stood up and looked around. There were no enemies rushing him. There was no gunfire. There was only the sound of wind chimes and the gentle lapping of water. He began to walk toward the central spire, which rose into the clouds like a needle of pure light. His danger sense was silent. That was wrong. In a war zone, it should be buzzing. Its silence was more terrifying than its scream. He crossed a bridge of hard light that hummed under his boots. He reached the courtyard of the spire and saw them. The Illuminate. They were tall, slender beings floating a few inches off the ground, draped in ceremonial robes of white and gold. They did not hold weapons. They held staffs that pulsed with blue energy. They were not attacking. They were watching him. Izuku raised his hands, his fingers twitching with the stored energy of Blackwhip. He waited for the first shot. It didn't come. Instead, a voice spoke in his head. It wasn't a sound. It was a thought that wasn't his own. It was a feeling of sorrow and pity. The broken one, the voice said. Izuku flinched and looked around for the source. One of the figures, an Illuminate illusionist, floated forward. It had no face, just a glowing eye in the center of its hood. You carry the ghosts of the past, the voice echoed in his skull. But you serve the masters of the lie. Izuku gritted his teeth and remembered his orders. Silence the voice. This was the voice. It was a psionic projection that was demoralizing the troops in this sector. He had to kill it. He charged 20% into his legs and dashed forward, a blur of black and green. He aimed a smash at the illusionist. The being didn't move. Just as his fist was about to connect, the world inverted. Up became down, left became right. His momentum was reversed, and he found himself flying backwards, slamming into a crystal pillar. He gasped as the air was knocked out of him. He wasn't hit by a force. His controls had been rewired. The Illuminate fought by altering perception. He stood up, shaking his head. The danger sense finally flared, a sharp spike of warning. A sniper shot from a tripwire unit on the spire. A beam of blue light burned the air where his head had been a millisecond before. He dodged, rolling to the side. The peace was broken. The courtyard erupted into a chaotic dance of light and shadow. Izuku fought with a desperation born of 3 years of nightmare. He used smokescreen to break their line of sight, but the Illuminate could see his mind. They predicted his movements. He used float to take the high ground, but they teleported instantly to match him. It was a chess match played at the speed of sound. He punched a hunter, shattering its robotic shield, and kicked a ghoul into the water. But for every one he defeated, 2 more warped in. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to capture him. They were using containment fields, walls of solid energy that boxed him in. He realized they were testing him, analyzing the quirk. "Why do you fight for them?" the voice asked, persistent and calm amidst the violence. "They enslaved you. They murdered your innocence. We offer clarity." Izuku screamed, a raw sound of frustration, and unleashed a Manchester smash that cracked the floating platform in half. "Shut up," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "I fight to save people. Even if the government is bad, the people are real." The voice paused. "The people are livestock," it said. "The bugs are fuel. The bots are labor. The Illuminate are the only ones who see the cage." Izuku didn't want to listen. He launched himself at the main spire, ignoring the enemies. He crashed through the stained glass window of the sanctum. Inside, it was quiet. In the center of the room stood a device. It wasn't a weapon. It was a projector. And standing in front of it was not an alien. It was a human. A woman. She wore the tattered remains of a scientist's lab coat. She was old, her hair grey and stringy, her face lined with the hardship of a castaway. She looked at Izuku with eyes that were terrifyingly sane. "I wondered who they would send," she said. Her voice was the one he had heard in his head. She was using the Illuminate tech to project her thoughts. She wasn't an alien. She was a defector. Izuku froze. The mission was to silence the voice. He had assumed it was a monster, but it was a human being. "Step away from the console," Izuku ordered, his voice trembling slightly. "I have orders to destroy it." The woman smiled sadly. "I know. The Ministry of Truth hates history. And this," she patted the machine, "is a history lesson." She tapped a key. A hologram sprang to life in the air between them. It was footage. Grainy, old footage. It showed a map of the galaxy from 100 years ago. It showed the borders of Super Earth. And then it showed the first shots fired. They weren't fired by aliens. They were fired by a Super Earth destroyer. They fired on a peaceful diplomatic vessel of the Illuminate. The footage changed. It showed the bug farms. It showed scientists injecting the bugs with growth hormones, forcing them to breed, forcing them to attack colonies, so that the military would have a reason to intervene and harvest the oil. It showed the Cyberstan mines, where cyborgs were worked to death before they rebelled. It was a catalogue of atrocities. The woman looked at him. "We are the villains, boy. We always were. The Illuminate just want us to stop expanding. They want to contain the cancer." Izuku stared at the footage. He knew it. Deep down, he had always known. But seeing it, undeniable and recorded, broke something in him. It wasn't the collar. It was the last thread of justification he had used to sleep at night. He had told himself he was the lesser of two evils, but there was no lesser evil. There was just the machine. The woman stepped closer to him. She held out a small data chip. "This contains the broadcast codes," she said. "If you plug this into the spire, it will send this truth to every helmet, every ship, every screen in the sector. The soldiers will see. The people will see." Izuku looked at the chip. Then he looked at the collar around his neck. If he disobeyed a direct order to destroy the target, the collar would detonate. He knew the protocols. Kane, or whoever was watching him now, had a finger on the button. "I can't," he whispered. "They'll kill me." The woman looked at the glowing green lines on his suit. "You are powerful," she said. "Maybe you can survive. Or maybe dying for the truth is better than living for the lie." She offered him the chip. This was the moment, the small choice. He could crush the chip, kill the traitor, and go back to his pod. He would be rewarded. He would get extra rations. He would get to sleep. Or he could take the chip and burn everything down. The comms in his helmet crackled. "Unit green." The handler's voice was icy. "Sensors detect you have engaged the target. Terminate immediately. Why are you hesitating?" Izuku looked at the woman. She wasn't afraid. She was tired. She reminded him of his mother, not in looks, but in the way she looked at him with hope. He reached out with a trembling hand. He didn't take the chip. He grabbed the woman's shoulder and pulled her behind him. "Unit green," the handler demanded. "Status report." Izuku took a deep breath. He channeled one for all, not 20%, not 45%. He felt the stockpile flood his veins like molten iron. "Status report," Izuku said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "The target is secured, but I am not terminating." The handler didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Detonating asset." Izuku felt the collar heat up. The beep was instantaneous. He had a fraction of a second. He didn't try to rip it off. He knew he couldn't. Instead, he did something insane. He focused the black whip not outward, but inward. He wove the tendrils of energy around his own neck, sliding them between his skin and the metal band. He layered them thick, compressing the energy until it was harder than diamond. He activated Fa Jin, building up kinetic potential in his neck muscles. He braced himself. The collar exploded. The force of the explosion was enough to decapitate a heavy devastator. The blast wave blew the windows of the sanctum outward and knocked the woman to the floor. Smoke filled the room. The handler on the ship watched the biomonitor flatline. "Asset neutralized," the handler said to the room of officers. "Deploy the cleanup crew." But on the surface of Schoolby, the smoke began to swirl. A green light pierced the grey cloud. Izuku Midoriya stood up. He was bleeding. His neck was a ruin of burned flesh and torn suit fabric. The black whip had absorbed 90% of the blast, but the impact had still nearly broken his spine. He was breathing in ragged, wet gasps, but his head was still attached to his body. He touched the raw skin where the collar had been. It was gone. He was free. He looked at the woman, who was staring at him in horror and awe. He walked over to the console. He took the data chip from her hand. His fingers were bloody, leaving red smears on the white plastic. He plugged the chip into the spire. "Upload it," he rasped. The spire began to hum. A beam of pure data shot up into the sky, piercing the atmosphere. High above in orbit, on the bridge of the SES Song of Judgment, the screens flickered. The tactical map was replaced by the grainy footage of the First War. The patriotic music was replaced by the voice of the woman narrating the genocide. Every Helldiver in the fleet, every crew member, every cook and engineer saw it. The bridge crew froze. The admiral screamed for them to cut the feed, but the signal was coming from the planet's core systems. It was unstoppable. Down on the planet, Izuku watched the beam of light. He knew what was coming next. They wouldn't send a squad. They wouldn't send a ship. They would send an orbital barrage. They would glass the site to bury the mistake. He turned to the woman. "We need to go," he said. "Now." She shook her head. "I can't. This spire needs a biological interface to keep the signal boosting. If I leave, the signal stops." She looked at him. "You go. You are the symbol now. They saw you survive the collar. They saw you defy them. You are the proof that they can be beaten." Izuku wanted to argue. He wanted to save her, but he felt the danger sense screaming like a siren. The sky turned red. The super destroyers were aligning their orbital cannons. "Go," she screamed, pushing him toward the balcony. "Be the hero you wanted to be." Izuku looked at her one last time. He grit his teeth so hard a molar cracked. He turned and ran. He activated float and gear shift. He launched himself off the spire, flying faster than he had ever flown. He broke the sound barrier, then Mach 2, then Mach 3. He was a green comet streaking across the water. Behind him, the sky opened up. A beam of 380 mm high-explosive ordnance slammed into the spire. The shockwave was a wall of death. It caught him in mid-air, hurling him forward like a leaf in a hurricane. He crashed into the ocean miles away, the water hitting him like concrete. He sank into the darkness, the light of the explosion fading above him. He drifted in the cold current. He was alive, free, but he was alone on a hostile planet, hunted by the most powerful military in history. And yet, as he lay in the dark water, he felt something he hadn't felt since he arrived in this universe. Hope. The signal had gone out. The seed was planted. The great lie had a crack in it, and he was the hammer that would widen it. He kicked his legs and began to swim toward the surface. He surfaced in a sea cave, hidden from the scans. He dragged himself onto the rocks and collapsed. His suit was flashing critical warnings. His body was failing. But then, a light appeared in the cave. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a teleportation circle. An Illuminate stood there. It was the illusionist from the courtyard. It looked at Izuku. It didn't attack. It floated closer and extended a long, slender finger. It touched Izuku's forehead. The pain in his body vanished, replaced by a cool numbness. "You have broken the chain," the Illuminate's voice echoed in his mind. "The compact is sealed. We will hide you until you are ready." The alien offered a hand. Izuku looked at it. A monster, an enemy, but the only one who had offered him a choice. He took the hand. The world dissolved in blue light. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the consequences of the small choice were beginning to ripple. On the jungle world of Malevolent Creek, a squad of Helldivers stopped firing. They looked at their tablets, watching the footage of the bug farms. One of them took off his helmet and threw it into the mud. On Super Earth, riots broke out in the manufacturing districts. The Ministry of Truth declared a state of emergency. The narrative was fracturing, and in the dark corners of the internet, a new symbol began to appear. Not the skull of the Helldivers, but a green rabbit, the symbol of the ghost who broke his collar. The war had changed. It was no longer about expansion. It was about revolution. And Izuku Midoriya was no longer a weapon. He was a leader. The image of 1,000 yellow holographic capes turning green on the galactic map. The color of the rebellion. The galaxy did not break cleanly. It shattered like a pane of glass struck by a hammer, sending shards of conflict spinning into every sector of the civilized worlds. The broadcast from the Skubai Shrine had not ended the war but had instead mutated it into something far more desperate and terrifying. It was no longer a war for territory or resources, but a war for the definition of reality itself. 6 months had passed since Izuku Midoriya vanished into the blue light of the Illuminate teleportation network, and in that time, the Federation of Super Earth had torn itself apart. The video of the bug farms and the cyborg slavery had played on a loop in the mess halls of 1,000 destroyers before the Ministry of Truth could scrub the network. Roughly 40% of the Helldiver Corps had defected. They painted their armor green and called themselves the Verdant Legion. They did not fight for a government. They fought for the idea that the boy who broke his collar represented, the idea of choice. But the loyalists fought back with the fury of true believers. They branded the rebels as traitors and chaos agents who were inviting the aliens to destroy humanity. The civil war raged across 50 systems, while the Terminids and automatons, sensing the weakness of their divided enemy, pushed their front lines deeper into human space than ever before. It was the apocalypse that High Command had always warned about, but they were the ones who had engineered it. Izuku Midoriya stood on the bridge of the captured supercarrier, formerly known as the SES Dawn of Pride, now renamed the SES Symbol of Peace. He looked different. The boy who had arrived in this universe with wide eyes and a broken arm was gone. In his place stood a young man who looked like he had been carved from scar tissue and determination. He wore a suit of armor that was a heresy of engineering. It was a fusion of stolen super-Earth ballistics plate and shimmering illuminate weave. It did not just protect him, it fed him. The Illuminate technology amplified his bioelectric field, allowing him to sustain higher percentages of one for all, for longer periods without breaking his bones. But the cost was high. His eyes glowed with a constant, unnatural luminescence, and his skin was pale, drained of color by the constant energy drain. He was leading the spearhead fleet to the heart of the enemy. They were not going to liberate a colony. They were going to Mars. Mars was the forge of the Federation. It was where the ships were built, where the weapons were tested, and where the High Command directed the war. To take Mars was to break the spine of the loyalist war machine. But it was the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy. The tactical map showed a grid of orbital defense cannons that was so dense it looked like a solid wall of fire. The rebel fleet dropped out of warp on the edge of the Sol system. There were hundreds of ships, a ragtag armada of stolen destroyers, retrofitted freighters, and Illuminate stealth crafts. The alarm klaxons on Mars began to scream before the ships even fully materialized. The void lit up with the exchange of railgun slugs and laser batteries. It was a slaughter. Izuku watched as a rebel cruiser to his left was cut in half by a loyalist orbital beam. He felt the deaths of the crew through the enhanced sensitivity of his quirk. It felt like a physical blow to his gut. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. He turned to the communication officer, a former democracy officer named Vance, who had defected after seeing the truth. Izuku gave the order to launch the drop. This time, there were no pods. The Illuminate technology allowed for short-range teleportation. Izuku stepped onto the pad. He was not going alone. He was leading the elite strike team, a group of defectors who had survived the worst the galaxy had to offer. There was a sniper from the wolf pack, a heavy gunner who had lost an arm on the creek and replaced it with a cybernetic claw, and a medic who carried a grenade launcher. They looked at Izuku with a reverence that made him uncomfortable. They thought he was a savior. He knew he was just a desperate kid with too much power. The world dissolved in blue light and reassembled instantly. They were on the surface of Mars. The air was red and choked with the smog of 1,000 factories. They had materialized in the logistics yard of the primary citadel. The ground was metal, not rock. Immediately, the suppression turrets swiveled toward them. Izuku moved before they could fire. He used gear shift to alter the inertia of his own body, accelerating instantly to supersonic speeds without the buildup of a run. He appeared next to the first turret and kicked it off its mount with a simple, brutal efficiency. The metal sheared and the turret spun away, firing wildly into the air. The alarm sounded and the doors to the citadel opened. Out marched the defenders. They were not bots. They were not bugs. They were Helldivers, loyalist soldiers wearing the pristine black and yellow of the skull. They hesitated for a fraction of a second when they saw the green ghost. The myth had reached them too, but their training overrode their fear. They opened fire. Izuku screamed at his team to use non-lethal force where possible, but in a firefight with explosive weaponry, non-lethal was a fairy tale. He saw his medic take a round to the shoulder and go down. He saw the heavy gunner cut a loyalist in half with his machine gun. It was the fratricide. Brother killing brother. Izuku felt a surge of rage that was hotter than One for All. He hated this. He hated that Kane and the High Command had forced these soldiers to die for a lie. He channeled 60% into his legs and launched himself into the center of the loyalist formation. He didn't punch them. He used Black Whip to grab their weapons and yank them out of their hands. He used Smokescreen to blind them. He moved like a whirlwind, disarming and disabling. He grabbed a loyalist by the chest plate and threw him into a pile of crates. The soldier looked up at him, terrified. Izuku paused. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice amplified by the suit. "We don't want to kill you." The soldier stared at the glowing green eyes and nodded slowly. But for every soldier who surrendered, 10 more pressed the attack. Tanks rolled out of the hangars. Walkers stomped across the flight deck. The sky above was burning as the fleets exchanged fire. Debris from destroyed ships rained down like meteors, crashing into the factories and shaking the ground. Izuku knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. They had to cut the head off the snake. The target was the central network hub, located at the top of the citadel. If they destroyed it, the orbital defense grid would go offline, and the rebel fleet could bombard the military factories into submission. Izuku looked up at the tower. It was a kilometer high, a fortress of black steel. He told his squad to hold the line at the entrance. He was going up. He activated float and kicked off the ground. He soared upward, dodging the anti-air flak that burst around him. He felt the wind tearing at his suit. He was flying through a storm of fire. He reached the observation deck of the citadel and crashed through the reinforced glass. He rolled to his feet and found himself in a massive circular room, filled with holographic screens and tactical displays. In the center of the room stood a man. It was Kane, but he was no longer the officer in the trench coat. He was encased in a prototype exosuit that looked like a mockery of the human form. It was bulky, covered in heavy plating, and armed with weapons that glowed with unstable plasma energy. Kane looked at Izuku through the open faceplate of the mech. His face was scarred and old, but his eyes were hard as flint. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He gestured to the screens around him which showed the galaxy burning. He asked Izuku if this was the peace he had wanted. He pointed to a screen showing a colony on the outer rim being overrun by Terminids because the Helldivers were supposed to protect it, were fighting each other here on Mars. He told Izuku that order required sacrifice. He said that the lie was the glue that held humanity together against a universe that wanted to eat them. He said that by breaking the lie, Izuku had doomed the species. Izuku looked at the screens. He saw the suffering. He saw the cost of his revolution. A doubt whispered in his mind. Maybe Kane was right. Maybe freedom was too expensive. But then he remembered the woman at the shrine. He remembered Graves dying for a corrupted hard drive. He remembered the child in the snow. He realized that a survival bought with the blood of the innocent wasn't survival. It was just a slow death. He tightened his fists. He told Kane that safety built on slavery wasn't safety. It was a prison, and he was here to break the walls down. Kane sighed and closed the faceplate of his mech. He said that if Izuku wanted to be a hero, He could die like one. The mech charged. It moved faster than a machine that size should move. It was powered by the same experimental stimulants that had been pumped into Izuku. Kane swung a plasma blade that crackled with the heat of a star. Izuku dodged, but the heat seared his armor. He countered with a Delaware smash, flicking his fingers to create an air bullet. The blast hit the mech's chest but barely scratched the paint. Kane laughed and unleashed a barrage of micro-missiles. The fight destroyed the command center. Consoles exploded, showering the room in sparks. Izuku was forced on the defensive. He couldn't get close enough to land a solid hit without being sliced in half by the plasma blade. He used Black Whip to swing from the ceiling rafters, moving erratically to throw off the mech's targeting computer. He realized that Kane was anticipating his moves. Kane had studied the combat data. He knew Izuku's patterns. Izuku needed to do something unpredictable. He needed to use the one thing Kane couldn't simulate, the will of the predecessors. He closed his eyes for a split second and reached into the core of One for All. He felt the anger of the second user, the speed of the third, the strength of All Might. He pulled it all together. He didn't just use the quirks, he fused them. He activated FA Jin and began to build up kinetic energy, not by moving, but by vibrating his own muscles at a microscopic level. It was a technique that threatened to tear his body apart. His suit screamed warnings, his bones groaned. Kane saw the energy building up. The green lightning turned white. Kane fired his main cannon, a beam of concentrated energy. Izuku opened his eyes. He didn't dodge. He moved through the beam. He used gear shift to warp the space around him, bending the light of the laser so it passed harmlessly over his shoulder. He closed the distance in an instant. He didn't punch the mech. He grabbed it. He grabbed the plasma blade with his left hand, the Black Whip coating his glove to protect him from the heat. The smell of burning leather and flesh filled the helmet. He held the blade still. With his right hand, he charged 100%. He didn't aim for the cockpit. He aimed for the joint, the connection between the power core and the weapons. Detroit smash. The impact was deafening. The mech's shoulder disintegrated. The arm holding the plasma blade fell off. The shockwave blew the back wall of the citadel out into the Martian atmosphere. Kane's mech stumbled back, leaking hydraulic fluid and sparks. Izuku didn't let up. He pressed the attack. He delivered a flurry of blows, each one landing with the weight of a cannon shell. He tore the missile launchers off the mech's back. He ripped the armor plating off the legs. He was dismantling the symbol of their power piece by piece. Kane fell. The mech crashed to the deck, a ruined heap of metal. Izuku stood over him, his chest heaving. His suit was shredded. His left hand was burned to the bone. But he had won. He reached down and ripped the faceplate off the mech. Kane looked up at him, bleeding from the mouth. Kane didn't beg. He smiled a bloody smile. He whispered that it didn't matter. He said that the protocol had already been initiated. Izuku looked at the central console. A red timer was counting down. Kane explained that if the citadel fell, the scorched earth protocol would trigger. It wasn't just a self-destruct for the base. It was a signal to the orbital ring. The defense cannons would turn inward. They would fire on the surface of Mars. They would destroy the factories, the cities, the workers, and the rebels. If Super Earth couldn't have Mars, no one could. It was the ultimate act of spite. Kane laughed. He said that Izuku had 2 minutes to stop it. But the manual override was located in the reactor core at the base of the tower, a kilometer down, and the elevators were destroyed. Izuku looked at the timer. 1:50. He looked at the hole in the wall. He could fly down, but he was exhausted. He had barely enough energy to stand. He looked at Kane. Why? Izuku asked. They are your people. Kane closed his eyes. They are resources, and resources must be denied to the enemy. Izuku turned away. He didn't kill Kane. He left him there in the wreckage. He walked to the edge of the broken wall. He looked down at the red planet. He thought of the millions of workers in the hab blocks below. He thought of the rebel soldiers fighting in the yard. He had to save them. He didn't have a choice. He channeled the last embers of One for All. He didn't just use the stockpile. He tapped into the life force of the quirk itself. He felt a burning sensation that went deeper than pain. He was burning his own lifespan to fuel the power. The embers roared into a bonfire. He jumped. He didn't fly. He dove. He streamlined his body and used gravity to pull him down faster. He became a living missile. He smashed through the roof of the lower levels. He crashed through floor after floor, shattering concrete and steel. He was a green comet burrowing into the earth. He reached the reactor chamber. It was a vast cavern filled with the humming blue light of the antimatter core. The override console was on a bridge above the core. The timer on his HUD read 0:30. He landed on the bridge. His legs gave out. He crawled. He crawled toward the console. His vision was blurring. He saw ghosts. He saw Banshee. He saw Graves. He saw All Might. They were urging him on. He reached the console. 0:10. He pulled himself up. He smashed his hand onto the override lever. It was stuck, rusted shut or sabotaged. 0:05. He couldn't pull it. He didn't have the strength. He looked at his right arm, the arm that had saved so many. He screamed. He wrapped Blackwhip around the lever and braced his feet against the console. He pulled with his back, with his soul. 0:02. The metal groaned. 0:01. The lever snapped down. The red lights turned green. The countdown stopped. The orbital cannons, which had already begun to charge, powered down. The silence that followed was heavy. Izuku fell to the floor. He lay there listening to the hum of the reactor. He had done it. He had saved Mars. But as he lay there, the comms in his helmet crackled to life. It was Vance. The voice was frantic. "Commander, the Illuminate ships. They're moving." Izuku struggled to focus. "What?" he rasped. Vance reported that the Illuminate fleet, which had been holding position at the edge of the system, had just engaged. But they weren't attacking the Loyalists. They were attacking the rebel fleet. They were destroying the weakened rebel ships that had survived the battle. Izuku stared at the ceiling. The Illuminate. The balance. He understood suddenly, with a cold clarity. The Illuminate didn't want the rebels to win. They wanted Super Earth to fall, but they didn't want a new, strong power to rise in its place. They wanted humanity broken. They had used Izuku to destroy the Federation, and now they were culling the survivors to ensure that humanity would never threaten them again. Izuku laughed. It was a dry, wheezing sound. Of course, in this universe, there were no allies, only interests. He had been a pawn on a different board. He tried to stand up, but he couldn't. He was done. He watched the tactical display on his wrist. He saw the green dots of his friends blinking out as the illuminated beams vaporized them. He had saved the civilians of Mars, but he had led his army into a trap. There was no clean victory. There was only survival. The reactor door opened. A squad of rebel medics rushed in. They had followed his path down. They found him lying there broken and laughing. They loaded him onto a stretcher. They told him they had to evacuate. The Illuminate were glassing the landing zones. They ran. They carried him through the ruins of the factory he had saved. They reached a shuttle. They took off just as an Illuminate tripod walker crested the ridge and fired a beam that turned the ground to glass where they had been standing. The shuttle broke orbit. Izuku looked out the window. He saw the devastation. The Loyalist fleet was destroyed. The Rebel fleet was scattering, hunted by the Illuminate. Mars was burning, but it was still there. The people were alive. He had traded the fleet for the planet, a strategic loss, a humanitarian victory, the kind of math that Super Earth would despise. The shuttle jumped to warp, fleeing the Sol system. They were heading for the Outer Rim, to the dark places where the Illuminate couldn't find them. Izuku closed his eyes. The war wasn't over. It had just changed phases. The Federation was dead. The rebellion was shattered. The aliens were ascendant. But the truth was out. The signal was still broadcasting. The seed was still there. 6 months later, a hidden base on an asteroid in the Umlaut sector. The room was dim. Izuku sat in a wheelchair. His legs were encased in braces. His right arm was gone, replaced by a mechanical prosthetic that hummed softly. He was watching a screen. It showed a video feed from a colony world. A group of farmers were standing in front of a silo. They were holding rifles. They were wearing green armbands. They had just fought off a bug attack without Super Earth support. They were cheering. They shouted a name. Deku. It wasn't a call sign anymore. It was a word that meant hope. Izuku touched the screen with his metal fingers. He looked at the reflection in the glass. He looked older, harder, but the eyes were the same. He turned the wheelchair around. In the back of the room, a new squad was waiting. Young recruits, defectors. They looked at him with awe. He didn't give them a speech about democracy. He didn't give them a speech about liberty. He looked at them and spoke one word. Ready? They nodded. He activated the holo table. A map of the galaxy appeared. It was a mess of red, blue, and purple. But there were patches of green, small, fragile patches. Then let's go save someone, he said. He stood up. The braces whirred. He walked. The green ghost was no longer a myth. He was a teacher, and the lesson had just begun. The universe was cruel, cold, and uncaring. But as long as one person stood up and said no, it wasn't hopeless. The story of the Helldiver named Deku was over. The story of the symbol of peace had finally begun. The file is labeled simply Legacy, and it was recovered from the databanks of a destroyed Illuminate tripod on the fringe of the galaxy, where the stars are few and the void is deep. It is not a battle plan or a manifesto, but a recording of a reality that has permanently shifted. The galaxy has changed since the fall of Mars and the subsequent collapse of the Central Federation government. The unified front of Super Earth has fractured into 100 warlord states and independent coalitions, each claiming to be the true successor of the old order, while others have rejected the concept of governance entirely. The Illuminate watch from the shadows of the dark sectors, manipulating the chaos and pruning civilizations before they grow too strong, while the Terminid swarms drift through the void, seeding worlds with biological horror. It is a darker age and a harder age, where safety is a memory and peace is a myth. But in the static of the comms network, there is a rhythm that persists. It is not the anthem of managed democracy, and it is not the screech of the alien. It is a heartbeat. On the planet of Estanu, a group of colonists are digging a trench in the frozen soil. They are tired, and they are hungry, and they have no orbital support to rain fire on their enemies. A pack of hunters crest the ridge, followed by a charger that tears up the earth. The colonists raise their rifles, which are scavenged and mismatched. They are not afraid in the way they used to be when they were waiting for permission to survive. They do not look to the sky for salvation, because they know no ship is coming to save them. They look to each other. One of them is a young girl who wears a scarf made from a shred of a yellow cape that has been dyed green with local berries. She fires the first shot, and the line holds. This is the legacy of the anomaly. The green ghost did not save the galaxy, and he did not end the war because to think that one man could stop the turning of the wheel is childish. What he did was far more dangerous to the established order. He broke the illusion that humanity was helpless without the collar. He proved that a hero is not a government asset, but simply someone who refuses to look away when the weak are being crushed. There are rumors, of course, because people need legends to keep them warm in the cryo-sleep of the long drifts. There are sightings of a black ship with no transponder code that appears in the darkest hours of the most hopeless battles. There are stories of a one-armed commander who moves with the speed of lightning and hits with the force of a meteor who vanishes before the dust settles. They say he is searching for something, a way to reset the board or a way to send the aliens back to the dark. But those are just stories told by the campfire. The reality is the mud, and the reality is the blood. But the difference is that now when a soldier dies, they do not die for a pie chart or a quarterly projection. They die for the person standing next to them. The statue in the center of the settlement is made of scrap metal, welded together by amateurs. It depicts a figure in broken armor, reaching out a hand not to strike, but to lift someone up. Etched into the base are words that have replaced the old slogans of the Federation. They are not about liberty, and they are not about freedom. They are about the only thing that matters in a universe this cold. Go beyond. The transmission ends there, and the screen fades to black. Outside the bunker, the wind howls carrying the spores of the enemy and the roar of the machines. But inside the bunker, a child picks up a helmet. He puts it on. He checks the seal. He is ready. The war is eternal, but so is the will to fight it. And somewhere out in the deep black, the ghost is still watching.